The El Paso sun beat down like a hammer on a railroad spike, a relentless golden menace that turned the adobe buildings into ovens and shimmered off the dust-choked streets. It was the summer of 1873, and the air was thick not just with heat and grit, but with a palpable sense of unease. For months, whispers had been slithering through the saloons and general stores. Tales passed between men over lukewarm whiskey and women over bolts of calico. Whispers of a man, a solitary figure who walked the desolate stretches of the Chihuahuan desert, a man who, they said, was completely naked. His name, or what they called him, was never spoken in polite company. He was simply the Nudist. The stories were dismissed at first, tall tales spun by lonely prospectors driven mad by the sun and the silence. But then, the sightings started to multiply. A freighter heading east saw him near the Rio Grande, a silhouette against the setting sun. A family traveling by wagon to Fort Bliss claimed to have seen him observing them from a high rock formation, his skin a ghostly white against the scorched earth. Deputy Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose face was as weathered and stern as the Texas landscape, had initially paid no mind to the gossip. He had more pressing matters, a spate of cattle rustling, a drunken brawl at the O'Malley's saloon, and the ever-present tension between the railroad men and the local ranchers. Elias was a pragmatist, a man of facts and reason. He dealt with the tangible world, with broken laws and busted heads. Fantasies of a naked desert hermit were beneath his notice. That changed one sweltering afternoon in July. Old Man Hemlock, the town's most cantankerous citizen and proprietor of the general store, stormed into Elias's office, his face a mottled red. He slammed his hand on the deputy's desk, sending a cloud of dust into the air. "Thorne, are you a lawman or a damn fool?" Hemlock snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I just saw him, with my own eyes, standing right outside my property line, not a stitch on him, staring, just staring at my little girl playing in the yard." Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his days chasing Apache raiders. This wasn't a drunken tale. Hemlock was a disagreeable man, but he was not a liar. The mention of his daughter, a shy 6-year-old girl named Sarah, brought the abstract fear into stark, terrifying reality. "Are you sure, Hemlock?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Positive. He was there, not 10 feet from the fence, didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. My wife saw him too. She screamed and he just walked away, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world." Elias stood up, strapping on his Colt Peacemaker. Which direction did he go? South, towards the foothills. But what good will that do? He moves like a ghost. He just appears and disappears. Elias left the office and walked a few blocks to Hemlock's home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Mrs. Hemlock, a frail woman with tear-streaked cheeks, confirmed her husband's story. She described the man's appearance in more detail. Tall, gaunt, with long, unkempt hair and a tangled beard. His skin, she noted, was a strange, almost deathly pale color, as if he had never been exposed to the sun. This was a direct contradiction to the earlier reports of him being dark from the sun. The details were inconsistent, yet the core fear was the same. The next day, Elias rode out alone into the desert. He followed the direction Hemlock had indicated, a compass in one hand and his rifle in the other. The vast, empty landscape stretched out before him, a sea of sagebrush and rock. He rode for hours, the only sounds the creak of his saddle and the rhythmic pounding of his horse's hooves. He found no tracks, no sign of a man or a camp. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Over the next week, the sightings escalated from whispers to a full-blown panic. A young couple picnicking by a stream was accosted by him. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply approached them, his pale eyes fixed on the woman and then turned and walked away. A group of cowboys found him standing by a small water trough, drinking from his cupped hands. When they shouted at him, he didn't run. He just looked at them with an unnerving, vacant expression, and then calmly walked into a dense thicket of mesquite, vanishing completely. The townsfolk started to demand action. El Paso was a small community, a fragile outpost on the edge of the wilderness, and the fear was a poison seeping into every corner of their lives. The children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. The women were afraid to hang their laundry out to dry. The men began to form armed patrols, but their search parties always came back empty-handed. The Nudist was a phantom, a living rumor that was slowly but surely terrorizing them all. Elias felt the pressure building. He was a lawman, and yet he was powerless against this silent, unexplainable threat. He couldn't arrest a ghost. He couldn't shoot a man who wasn't breaking any law other than the unspoken one of decency. But his inaction was seen as incompetence, and the respect he had spent years earning was beginning to erode. One evening, as he was closing up his office, a small boy came running up to him, his face pale with terror. It was Billy, the son of the saloon keeper. He was shivering even in the oppressive heat. "Deputy Elias," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. He was in our barn. Standing by the horse stall, he was just watching our horse. Elias felt a new chilling wave of fear wash over him. The Nudist was getting closer. He was no longer a distant threat in the desert. He was right here, in the heart of El Paso. The town was no longer a sanctuary. "He didn't say anything?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "No," Billy whimpered. "But he was holding something. I couldn't see what it was, but it was a doll. A little doll, like the one my sister plays with." He was just holding it and looking at the horse. A wave of cold certainty washed over Elias. This wasn't a crazy hermit. This was something else. A predator, a silent, unnerving force of nature that was slowly closing its grip on the town. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button to follow the full journey. Your support helps bring more mysteries to life. The news of the doll spread like wildfire, a spark of pure terror igniting the dry tinder of the town's fear. The whispers turned into shouts, the unease into outright panic. Elias spent the next morning in a feverish, fruitless search of the area around the saloon's barn, finding nothing. Not a footprint, not a discarded trinket, nothing. It was as if the Nudist had simply dissolved into the parched earth. The doll, a simple homemade rag figure, belonged to Billy's sister Sarah. She had been playing with it in the yard just a few hours before the sighting. The family was distraught. The Nudist wasn't just observing from afar anymore. He was taking things. He was leaving a calling card. The doll was a violation, an intimate breach of their sanctuary. The townsfolk were no longer content with armed patrols. They demanded a full-scale posse. Sheriff Thompson, a portly, complacent man who had left most of the law enforcement duties to Elias, was forced to act. He organized a dozen men, all armed and grim-faced, to comb the foothills and the desert. Elias, despite his growing skepticism, joined them. He had to. His own credibility and the town's last shred of order depended on it. The posse rode for 3 days, their frustration growing with every fruitless hour. They scoured every canyon, every mesquite thicket, every hidden arroyo. They found nothing. No camp, no supplies, no sign of a man who could survive in such a harsh environment without any obvious means of sustenance. It was as if he was a part of the land itself, a spectral entity that lived off the fear he sowed. Elias, with his keen eye for detail, was the most disturbed. He had been a scout in his youth, and he knew the desert. A man couldn't just vanish. He needed water, food, and shelter. But there were no tracks, no discarded remains of food, no hidden caves. The man was a biological impossibility, and that's what made him so terrifying. He was operating outside the rules of survival, outside the boundaries of human logic. On the third day, a blinding sandstorm descended upon them, a violent tempest that swallowed the sun and whipped up the sand into a stinging maelstrom. The men were forced to huddle together, their hats pulled low, their faces wrapped in bandanas. When the storm finally subsided, they were disoriented and exhausted. They gave up the search and returned to El Paso, defeated. The defeat was a bitter pill for the town to swallow. The fear intensified, taking on a new, more sinister character. People began to lock their doors at night, the saloon trade dwindled. The children were kept indoors, their youthful laughter replaced by a nervous, unnatural quiet. Elias, for his part, began his own, more methodical investigation. He started talking to people again, not just about the sightings, but about anything out of the ordinary. He spoke to the drifters who passed through town, the freighters who came from the east, the ranchers whose spreads bordered the desolate lands. He was looking for a pattern, a small, logical thread he could pull on. He found nothing. The stories were all the same. A silent, unmoving figure, a pale man with vacant eyes, a ghost in the desert. The only difference was the location, and even those seemed random, unconnected. One sighting near the Rio Grande, another near Fort Bliss, a third in the foothills, a fourth in a town barn. There was no logical progression, no discernible motive. He wasn't a thief, he wasn't a murderer, he wasn't even a vagrant seeking shelter. He was simply there. Then a new detail emerged. A woman named Clara, a laundress, came to his office, trembling. She had been washing clothes in her yard when she saw him. He was standing on the far side of her property, partially obscured by a mesquite tree. But she saw him clearly. And she saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. He was wearing a necklace, she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. It was a simple leather cord, and on it was a tooth, a large tooth. It looked like a human tooth, Deputy. Elias felt a knot tighten in his gut. A human tooth? The man was collecting things, not just dolls, but teeth. The thought was so vile, so incomprehensible, that it sent a shiver down his spine despite the heat. Was this a sick game? A ritual? The question of motive, of why, was a crushing weight on his mind. He went to the local doctor, a grizzled man named Dr. Finch, and asked him if he had any knowledge of such things. Finch, a man of science and logic, dismissed the idea. A human tooth? Out in the desert? It's probably a coyote tooth or a goat's. Her mind is playing tricks on her, Elias. The entire town is on a powder keg. But Elias couldn't dismiss it. He couldn't shake the image of a pale man standing in the scorching sun, wearing a human tooth as a trophy. It was a detail so bizarre, so specific, that it had to be real. That night, Elias was sitting in his office, his head in his hands, when a frantic pounding on the door shattered the silence. It was Mrs. Hemlock, the same woman who had reported the first sighting. She was a ghost, her face ashen, her body trembling uncontrollably. "My Sarah," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "She's gone." Elias stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Gone? What do you mean?" "We put her to bed an hour ago. We went to check on her. The window was open. And her blanket, her favorite blanket, it's gone. It's not in the room. And there's a trail of muddy footprints leading from her bed to the window." The air in the office went cold. The nudist didn't just observe. He didn't just take. He took children. The silent, unsettling predator had finally made his move, and a new, more terrifying chapter had begun. The disappearance of Sarah Hemlock was not a whisper, not a rumor. It was a scream that echoed through the quiet streets of El Paso, shattering the last remnants of its peaceful existence. The town, which had been paralyzed by fear, was now galvanized by a cold, searing rage. The search for the nudist was no longer about a strange hermit, it was about a kidnapped child. Elias, with Sheriff Thompson's reluctant blessing, organized a new search party. But this one was different. It wasn't a posse filled with frustrated men. It was a dedicated team composed of the town's most experienced trackers and hunters, men who knew the desert like the back of their hands. They were joined by a weary but determined Mr. Hemlock, who, despite his grief, was a pillar of unyielding resolve. They followed the muddy footprints from Sarah's room. The trail led from the window, across the dusty yard, and then vanished abruptly on the hard-packed road. It was an impossible end to the trail. A kidnapper would have left a continuous path, a sign of their passing. This was a dead end, a riddle that defied all logic. Elias, however, noticed something the others missed. A faint, almost imperceptible scratch mark on the windowsill. It wasn't a knife mark, it was a claw mark, a deep, curving gouge that seemed too large for a human hand. He filed the detail away. A small, unsettling piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. They expanded their search, fanning out in all directions from the Hemlock's home. The sun rose, a merciless eye in the sky, and the search intensified. They called out Sarah's name, their voices hoarse with desperation, their calls swallowed by the vast, silent expanse of the desert. The hours stretched into a torturous eternity. As they searched, the details of the nudist's actions became the subject of feverish discussion. The stolen doll, the human tooth necklace, the bizarre behavior. Each detail, once an isolated curiosity, now fit into a pattern of escalating predatory actions. He wasn't a crazy man, he was a methodical hunter, a silent menace who was slowly, deliberately terrorizing the town. Elias couldn't shake the image of Sarah's blanket being taken. Why would a kidnapper, in the middle of a hot summer night, take a blanket? It served no purpose. It was a bizarre personal violation, a cruel act that suggested a motive far more sinister than a simple ransom. The search party, exhausted and demoralized, returned to El Paso in the evening, their hands empty, their hopes crushed. The town's despair was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket of sorrow that settled over every home. Mrs. Hemlock was inconsolable, and Mr. Hemlock's silent, stony grief was more terrifying than any scream. Elias, however, refused to give up. He was haunted by the claw mark on the windowsill, a detail that contradicted everything they knew about the kidnapper. A man couldn't make a mark like that. But a man, as they were learning, was a very loose term for the nudist. He decided to go back to the Hemlock's home, this time alone, in the dead of night. He needed to see the scene again, without the distraction of the frantic search party. He arrived under the cover of a starless sky, the only sound the rustle of the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. He re-examined the windowsill. The claw mark was still there, a thin, dark line in the pale wood. He ran his finger over it, his mind racing. He then noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, dark smudge on the inside of the window frame. He leaned in, his nose close to the wood. It was a thin layer of something powdery. He touched it and brought his finger to his nose. The smell was faint but distinct, a sharp metallic tang. It smelled like blood. A new wave of dread washed over him, colder and more terrifying than anything he had felt before. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was an abduction, a brutal, violent act. The kidnapper had been in the room, had fought with Sarah, and had left a trail of evidence. But why had no one heard anything? Why had there been no screams? He went back to the trail of footprints in the yard. He had dismissed them as too shallow, too faint. But now, with his new knowledge, he looked closer. He got down on his hands and knees, a lantern in one hand, his eyes scanning the ground. And he saw it, a series of tiny, almost invisible indentations on the hard-packed dirt. They weren't footprints. They were a series of shallow, circular depressions, as if someone had walked on their hands and feet, dragging their body across the ground. The image was so vile, so grotesque, that he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was not a human being. A man couldn't move like that. A man couldn't make a claw mark on a windowsill and leave a trail of blood. Elias felt a new, chilling certainty settle in his gut. The nudist of El Paso wasn't a hermit, not a vagrant, not even a killer. He was something else, a being of unimaginable darkness that was now, with Sarah, in his clutches. And Elias, a man of facts and reason, was now faced with a mystery that defied all logic, a predator that was neither man nor beast. He had to find Sarah before it was too late. He had to face a truth that was more terrifying than any nightmare he could have imagined. The town was a pressure cooker, and Elias was at the center of the steam. The discovery of the blood and the strange tracks was a new, horrifying piece of the puzzle, but it only deepened the mystery, pushing it further into the realm of the incomprehensible. The townsfolk, already on edge, were now consumed by a gnawing fear that was part terror and part religious dread. The nudist wasn't just a criminal, he was a demonic force, a thing of darkness that had come to prey on their community. Elias, however, was a man of logic. He dismissed the supernatural theories, the claw marks, the blood, the bizarre tracks. All of it could be explained by a human. A deranged human, yes, but a human nonetheless. He just hadn't found the right explanation yet. He spent the next day talking to everyone, looking for any information that might shed light on the nudist's identity. He talked to the stagecoach driver, the bartender at the saloon, the old man who sold eggs in the market. He was looking for a name, a description, anything that could give him a lead. His search finally led him to an unlikely source, a young prostitute named Lila, who worked at the O'Malley's saloon. Lila was known for her sharp wit and her even sharper observations. She had seen it all, and she wasn't one to scare easily. Elias found her in a quiet corner of the saloon, sipping on a sarsaparilla. She looked tired, her eyes hollow, and her usual boisterous energy was gone. "Lila," Elias said, his voice low, "I need to ask you about the nudist. Have you seen him, or heard anything new?" Lila took a sip of her drink, her gaze fixed on the bottom of the glass. "Heard plenty, deputy, but seeing is a different thing. And I've seen him." Elias felt a jolt of adrenaline. "Where? When?" "It was about a month ago, maybe more," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "I was walking back from my room, late at night. The moon was out, bright as day. I saw him on the edge of town near the old cemetery. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking at the headstones." Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Did he see you?" "I don't know. He didn't look at me, he just stared at the graves. But I saw him. He wasn't like the others, he was clean. And his skin, it was like alabaster, pale, like he never saw the sun. And he was bald, not a single hair on his head or face." Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. This contradicted every single description he had heard so far, the long, unkempt hair and beard, the weathered skin. This was a completely different person. Or were the other witnesses simply too terrified to see clearly? "Lila," Elias said, his voice strained. "Are you sure about this? The others say he has long hair and a beard." "I'm sure, deputy. It was him. I saw him clearly. And he was holding something, a shovel, and he was digging a grave. Right there, in the middle of the night." Elias felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The nudist wasn't just observing, he was desecrating graves. He was a grave robber. And the human tooth necklace, it wasn't a random trophy, it was a grotesque memento from a fresh corpse. This wasn't a random act of terror, it was a sick, methodical ritual. He went to the cemetery the next morning. It was a quiet, overgrown place, filled with crooked headstones and wilting flowers. He found nothing. No fresh graves, no disturbed earth. Lila's story, for all its horrifying detail, was a dead end. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something. A small, almost invisible path that led away from the cemetery into a dense patch of thorny brush. He followed it, his gut telling him he was on the right track. The path led him to a small, hidden cave, almost invisible from the outside. He drew his Colt peacemaker, his heart thumping in his chest, and entered the cave. The air was cool and still. The cave was small, but the walls were lined with strange drawings. Figures of people, all of them naked, standing in a circle, their arms outstretched. They were all faceless, featureless. And in the center of the circle, a small, childlike figure was depicted, with a large, grinning face. Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was a sick mind, a person who had retreated from the world and was now living a twisted, horrifying reality. He took a step further into the cave, his eyes scanning the drawings. He then saw it, a small, carefully crafted wooden doll with a smiling face. It was the exact same doll that had been found in the saloon's barn. And next to it, a small, intricately carved wooden figurine of a horse. It was the same horse from the barn. The nudist wasn't just taking things, he was recreating them in his own twisted way. And then he saw it. A small blood-stained rag with the faint outline of a flower on it. It was the same design as the one on Sarah's blanket. The nudist had her blanket. He had her. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. He was close. He was so close. He was about to leave the cave when he saw it. A small, leather-bound notebook sitting on a flat rock. He opened it, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with strange, spidery handwriting. It was a diary, a chronicle of a descent into madness. And he read it. He read about a man named Arthur, a former prospector who had lost his family to a brutal raid. He had gone mad with grief and had retreated from the world, from his old life. He had begun to believe that the world was a lie, a fabricated reality that was meant to hide the truth. He had stripped himself of his clothes, of his identity, and had begun to live as a new person, a person who could see the world as it truly was. He had begun to collect things, to recreate the world in his own distorted image. He had been so consumed by his grief and his delusions that he had lost all sense of reality. The nudist was a human, a broken, shattered man who was living in his own personal hell. But he wasn't a grave robber, he wasn't a killer. He was a broken man who was now a kidnapper. Elias felt a new, chilling wave of certainty wash over him. The nudist was a man, a deranged man, and he was here. He had Sarah, and he was planning something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And Elias, a man of logic and reason, was now faced with a reality that defied all logic, a man who was neither good nor evil, but a horrifying amalgamation of the two. The pages of Arthur's journal were a window into a shattered mind, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of human grief and delusion. Elias read on, his heart a cold knot in his chest. Arthur, or what was left of him, chronicled his withdrawal from society, his self-imposed exile, and his bizarre, self-proclaimed mission to unveil the naked truth. He believed that the world, with its clothes and its conventions, was a lie, a fabricated reality that was meant to hide the true, unadorned nature of existence. His ramblings spoke of collecting truths, which Elias now understood to be the stolen items from the townspeople. He had taken the doll, the blanket, the human tooth not as trophies of violence, but as reminders of the truth, as twisted, pathetic mementos of a world he no longer understood. The drawings on the cave walls were not rituals. They were his attempts to recreate the world in his own image, a world of faceless, naked figures that were free from the deceit of clothing and the artifice of society. But the final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was what truly terrified Elias. It was a chilling prophecy of Arthur's own making. He had taken a child, a truthful one, to be his companion, to be a part of his new unadorned world. He had taken Sarah, and his final entry spoke of a final ceremony, a ritual of revelation that would take place on the coming solar eclipse in 2 days' time. The location, cryptically referred to as the birthplace of truth, was a riddle that Elias had to solve before it was too late. Elias left the cave, the weight of Arthur's journal heavy in his hands. He was no longer a lawman chasing a phantom. He was a man hunting a broken, deluded human being, a man who was on the verge of doing something unspeakably terrible. He went directly to Sheriff Thompson's office, laid the journal on the desk, and explained everything. The sheriff, a man of routine and order, was bewildered, his face a mask of disbelief. A naked man, a solar eclipse, a final ceremony. Thompson scoffed, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Elias, you've been out in the sun too long. This is insane." "It's the truth, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice flat. "This man is delusional. He believes he's a prophet. He's planning to do something to that little girl. We have to find him before he does." Thompson, however, was a man of politics, not a man of action. He was a lawman who dealt with facts, not with prophecies and mental illness. He refused to mobilize another posse based on what he called the ravings of a madman. He advised Elias to rest, to clear his head, and to let him handle the search. Elias knew he was on his own. He returned to his office, his mind racing. He had to figure out the location of the birthplace of truth. He reread the journal, searching for clues, for any hint that could point him in the right direction. He looked at the drawings, the bizarre symbols, the strange phrases. Nothing. It was a closed loop, a puzzle with no solution. He decided to go back to the cemetery, to the place where Lila had seen Arthur. He needed to find a clue that he had missed. He scoured the graveyard, his eyes on the ground, his mind trying to think like Arthur. He looked for a headstone that was out of place, a grave that was more recent, a name that was significant, and he found it. A new headstone, small and unmarked, covered in a thin layer of dust. He cleared the dust away and read the inscription. It was a single word: Arthur. It was his own grave, a monument to a man who had died and been reborn in his own twisted mind. He looked at the date on the headstone, October 18th, 1869, the day his family had been killed in a raid, the day he had lost everything. And then he saw something else. A small, almost invisible carving on the headstone. It was a sun with a single line through it. A solar eclipse. The birthplace of truth. The location was not a place but a moment in time. Elias felt a new wave of dread wash over him. The solar eclipse was 2 days away. He had to find Arthur and Sarah before then. But where was he? The cemetery was a dead end. He went back to the cave. He looked at the drawings again, his eyes scanning every detail, every line. And he saw it. A small, almost invisible symbol on the cave wall, near the drawings of the faceless figures. It was a symbol he had seen before, on an old map of the region that was stored in the sheriff's office. It was the symbol for the old adobe mission, an abandoned church on the outskirts of El Paso, a place that was rumored to be haunted and was now a dilapidated ruin. Elias felt a surge of hope. He had a location. He had a motive. He had a deadline. He knew where Arthur was, and he knew what he was going to do. He rode to the mission, his heart pounding in his chest. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert. The mission was a dilapidated ruin, its adobe walls crumbling, its wooden doors rotted away. He dismounted his horse and entered the dark, musty interior. The air was cold, and the only sound was the rustle of the wind. He saw him. Arthur. He was standing in the center of the church, his back to Elias. He was completely naked, his pale skin a ghostly white in the dim light, and in his arms He was holding Sarah. She was sleeping, her small body curled up against his. He was rocking her gently, a soft, soothing hum escaping his lips. Elias felt a wave of relief and terror, relief that he had found her, terror that he was now face to face with a man who was completely detached from reality. He drew his gun, his hands trembling. "Arthur," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Let her go." Arthur turned around, his eyes vacant, his face a mask of serene, unnerving calm. He didn't seem to notice the gun. He simply looked at Elias, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his lips. "I can't, Deputy," he said, his voice a soft, hypnotic whisper. "She's the truth. She's the one who will set us all free." The air in the old mission hung heavy with dust and dread. Elias stood in the entrance, his gun steady in his hand, his gaze fixed on Arthur and the small, sleeping form of Sarah. Arthur's eyes, devoid of any malice, were a reflection of a mind completely lost to itself, a serene void that was more terrifying than any rage. "Arthur, this is a mistake," Elias said, his voice a desperate plea. "She's just a little girl. Let her go. We can get you help." Arthur's smile didn't waver. "Help? You want to help me put on a lie? To dress me in your clothes and put me back in your false world? No, Deputy. She is my truth. She is pure. She will show them all." He continued to rock Sarah, his actions gentle and paternal, an unsettling contrast to the grim reality of the situation. Elias could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, unharmed. But for how long? The solar eclipse was less than 48 hours away. The thought of what Arthur planned to do during his ceremony of revelation sent a cold shiver down Elias's spine. He knew he couldn't shoot him. The slightest tremor of his hand, the slightest flinch from Arthur, could startle the man and put Sarah in danger. He had to talk him down. He had to reach the man buried beneath the madness. "Arthur, I know what happened to your family," Elias said, taking a step closer, his voice soft. "I know the pain you've been through. But this isn't the way. This isn't a way to honor them." A flicker of something, pain, memory, sorrow, crossed Arthur's eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same vacant calm. "They are with the truth now," he said, his voice a whisper. "They were freed from the lies, just as she will be." Elias felt a surge of frustration. The man was a fortress of delusion, a mind so fractured that reason couldn't penetrate it. He had to try a different approach. He had to find a crack in that serene facade. "Arthur, she's cold," Elias said, his eyes fixed on Sarah's small body. "She needs her blanket, the one you took from her room. She can't be a part of your world if she's sick. She needs to be warm." A flicker of confusion crossed Arthur's face. He looked at Sarah, then down at his pale, exposed skin. He had been so consumed by his truth that he hadn't considered the simple human needs of the child in his arms. The contradiction was a small, almost invisible thread that Elias could pull on. "The blanket is a lie, Deputy," Arthur said, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It's a symbol of your false world." "It's a symbol of love, Arthur," Elias countered, his voice steady. "Her mother made it for her. It keeps her safe. It keeps her warm. If you truly want to honor the truth, you have to protect her. You have to keep her safe. A lie can't protect her, only the truth can." Arthur's eyes, which had been so serene, began to shift. He looked from Sarah to Elias, a silent battle raging in his mind. The cold, scientific logic of his delusion was now faced with the emotional, unassailable truth of human love. The blanket wasn't a lie. It was a tangible expression of a mother's love for her child, a love that transcended the naked world he had created for himself. He lowered Sarah to the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. He then reached into a small bag he had hidden in a pile of rubble and pulled out the blood-stained blanket. He draped it over Sarah, his hands trembling slightly. "The truth is cold, deputy," he said, his voice now a strained whisper. "But it is not cruel." This was it. The moment Elias had been waiting for. The man, buried deep beneath the delusion, was resurfacing. The grief, the love, the humanity that he had tried so hard to deny was now staring him in the face. "Arthur, let's go outside," Elias said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We can talk about this. We can talk about your family. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to do this at all." Arthur looked at Elias, a flash of recognition in his eyes. He saw not a lawman, not an enemy, but a man who was trying to understand him, a man who was offering him a way out of his personal hell. He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. Then the calm was replaced by a look of wild, unhinged fear. He looked at the shadows on the walls of the mission, at the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, as if he was seeing a ghost. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a new, horrifying terror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're watching us, the faceless ones. They won't let me go." He suddenly lunged for Sarah, his movements no longer slow and gentle, but frantic and desperate. Elias reacted instantly. He holstered his gun and dove forward, tackling Arthur to the ground. The two men struggled in the dust, a silent, desperate fight for the life of a small girl. Arthur was strong, his body lean and wiry from years in the desert, and he fought with a primal ferocity. Elias, despite his experience, was struggling. He managed to pin Arthur's arm down, but the man was writhing, his eyes wild with terror. Then he stopped. His body went limp, his eyes rolled back in his head, and a thin line of foamy blood appeared at the corner of his lips. He had an epileptic seizure, a neurological event brought on by the stress and the emotional turmoil of the moment. Elias, a man of facts and reason, knew this was not a supernatural event. It was a human one, a physical manifestation of a mind that had reached its breaking point. He quickly secured Arthur, tying his hands and feet with a piece of rope he had brought with him. He then went to Sarah, who was still asleep, her face peaceful in the soft light of the mission. He picked her up, her body a feather-light weight in his arms, and carefully carried her out of the mission. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a fiery blaze of orange and red, a beautiful, peaceful contrast to the darkness he had just left behind. The morning sun rose, a gentle reprieve from the dark terror of the night. Sarah, safe and sound, was returned to her parents. The town's despair was replaced by a collective sigh of relief, a communal exhalation of fear that had been held for months. The townsfolk, who had been so quick to condemn Elias for his inaction, were now praising him as a hero. Sheriff Thompson, however, was less than pleased. Arthur, now shackled and lucid after his seizure, was in a holding cell. Thompson had called in a doctor who had confirmed that Arthur's madness was the result of a severe, long-term case of grief and malnutrition. He was not a demon. He was a human, a broken man who had lived in his own personal hell for years. Thompson was a man who craved a clean, simple case, and a madman was far from it. He wanted a confession, a simple, straightforward narrative that he could present to the community. He wanted a clear-cut case of kidnapping, a motive of a deranged mind, and a resolution that would put the town at ease. Elias, however, had other plans. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know the why of it all. He sat down with Arthur, in the cold, silent confines of the holding cell. Arthur, now dressed in a simple cotton shirt and pants, was a different man. The serene, vacant look was gone, replaced by a deep, heartbreaking sorrow. His eyes, once so empty, were now filled with the pain of a man who had been a ghost for years and was now faced with the reality of his actions. "Why, Arthur?" Elias asked, his voice low and compassionate. "Why did you take her?" Arthur's gaze was fixed on the floor, his hands shaking slightly. I don't know. I was trying to find them. My family, I thought if I stripped myself of everything of the world's lies, I could find them." I thought she was a part of my truth. I thought she could bring them back. His voice was a strained whisper filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost a physical presence in the room. Elias, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, was moved. This wasn't a monster. This was a man who had lost everything and had gone mad with grief. The doll, the blanket, the human tooth, Elias said, his voice gentle. Why did you take those? Arthur looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. The doll? The blanket? I didn't take those. I found them. They were left for me. A gift from the faceless ones. They were helping me find the truth. Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Arthur didn't take the items. He found them. The doll, the blanket, the human tooth, and the faceless ones. The phrase, which Elias had dismissed as a delusion, now took on a new, more sinister meaning. Arthur, Elias said, his voice strained, there are no faceless ones. You were alone in the desert. Arthur shook his head, a single tear rolling down his cheek. No. They were there. They were always there. They spoke to me. They told me what to do. They told me to go to the cemetery, to dig a grave, to take the truth. Elias's mind was racing. This was a new, more terrifying puzzle. If Arthur didn't take the items, who did? Who was leaving him these grotesque gifts, and why? He left the cell, his mind in a state of turmoil. He went back to the old mission, to the cave, and to the cemetery. He re-examined everything, looking for a clue he had missed. The claw marks, the blood on the windowsill, the strange tracks. They were all still there. Arthur, in his state of delusion, was physically incapable of making those marks. He was gaunt. His hands were frail. He couldn't have made those marks, and he couldn't have left those tracks. This wasn't a single deranged man. This was something else. A conspiracy. A manipulation. Someone was using Arthur, a man who was already on the edge of sanity, to terrorize the town. Someone was leaving him the items, feeding his delusions, and pushing him to do something terrible. But who? And why? Elias, a man who had just solved one mystery, was now faced with a new, more horrifying one. He had to find the real perpetrator, the person who was truly responsible for the terror that had gripped El Paso. He had to find the faceless ones before they struck again. He had to face a truth that was more terrifying than any nightmare he could have imagined. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button to follow the full journey. Your support helps bring more mysteries to life. The town's relief was a fragile thing, a temporary calm before a new, more violent storm. The news of Arthur's confession and the theory of an unknown accomplice spread like a cancer. The townsfolk, who had been on the verge of celebrating, were now plunged back into a new, more intense terror. They weren't dealing with a single madman. They were dealing with a hidden enemy, a conspirator who was pulling the strings from the shadows. Sheriff Thompson, a man who hated complexity, refused to believe Elias. "You're grasping at straws, Elias," he said, his face red with frustration. "The man is mad. He's making things up. The case is closed. We have our man." Elias, however, knew he was right. He had seen the claw marks, the blood, the impossible tracks. He had heard Arthur's terrified confession. He couldn't dismiss it. He was a lawman, and his duty was to the truth, no matter how unsettling it was. He went to the one person he could trust, his longtime friend and confidant, the doctor, Dr. Finch. Finch, a man of science and reason, was the only one who could give him a logical explanation for the physical evidence. Elias laid it all out. The claw marks, the blood, the strange dragging tracks, the human tooth necklace, the stolen blanket. He showed him the page from Arthur's journal, where he spoke of the faceless ones and the gifts. Finch listened patiently, his face a mask of concentration. He then took a magnifying glass and examined the claw marks on the piece of wood from the windowsill. He looked at the blood sample, which Elias had carefully collected. He then asked for the human tooth from the necklace, which was now in the sheriff's office. After an hour of intense examination, Finch looked up, his face pale with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Elias," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "The claw marks, they are not from a human hand. They are from a person, yes, but they are a form of a birth defect. It's a very rare condition where the fingers are fused together, forming a hand that resembles a claw." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. A birth defect, a congenital condition. This wasn't a supernatural event. It was a human one, a terrifyingly real one. "The blood," Finch continued, his voice trembling. "It's O negative, a very rare blood type. I have only seen one other case in my years here. A boy who passed through town many years ago. His name was Thomas. He had the same condition as well." Elias felt a new wave of dread wash over him. Thomas, a boy with a birth defect and a rare blood type. The human tooth, the necklace, it all fit. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were real, and they were here. He then asked Finch about the dental work on the tooth. Finch examined it, and a look of grim recognition crossed his face. "This tooth," he said, his voice low. "It has a very unique filling. It's a gold filling, a very old and specific type of dental work. I have only seen one other like it." "Whose?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "It belonged to a man named Jacob, a dentist who came to town about a year ago. He disappeared about 6 months back. No one thought anything of it. People come and go in this town." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. Jacob, the dentist. He was the one with the human tooth. He was the one who had died. The human tooth on Arthur's necklace was not a trophy. It was a warning, a message, a calling card. He went back to the sheriff's office, his mind in a state of controlled chaos. He presented his new evidence to Thompson, who, to his credit, was now listening. The scientific evidence, the cold, hard facts, were undeniable. "We have a killer on our hands, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice flat. "Someone who is killing people and using a madman to cover his tracks. We have a name, Thomas. We have a victim, Jacob." Thompson, now visibly shaken, agreed to launch a full-scale investigation. They began to question everyone in town, looking for any information about a man named Thomas, a boy with a birth defect. No one knew anything. He was a ghost, a phantom who had passed through the town years ago and was now back, a silent, malevolent force. That night, a new, more horrifying event occurred. A fire broke out at the El Paso General Store, Old Man Hemlock's place. The fire was deliberate, a malicious act of arson. The store was engulfed in flames, its contents a burning pyre of wood and goods. And in the middle of the blaze, standing completely still, was a figure, a man, with long, unkempt hair and a tangled beard. He was watching the fire, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. He was holding something in his hand, a small wooden figurine of a horse. The town, which had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief, was now plunged back into a new, more intense terror. The Nudist was back, and this time he was a killer. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality, a horrifying, violent reality. And Elias, a man who had just solved one mystery, was now faced with a new, more terrifying one. He had to find the real perpetrator, the man who was truly responsible for the terror that had gripped El Paso. He had to find the faceless ones before they struck again. The fire at Hemlock's General Store was a message, a brutal and undeniable statement. The townsfolk watched in horror as their communal hub, their last bastion of normalcy, was consumed by flames. The sight of the Nudist, a figure they believed to be safely locked away, was a terrifying shock. The fear was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a collective shriek of terror that echoed through the streets of El Paso. Elias, with Sheriff Thompson's reluctant help, began the investigation. They found no physical evidence, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. The fire had been set with kerosene, a simple, brutal act of arson. The horse figurine, a miniature replica of the one in the saloon's barn, was a chilling calling card. It was a direct link to the earlier terror, a message that the real perpetrator was still out there, mocking them, playing a sick game. Elias, however, had a new, more terrifying piece of evidence: the sighting of the nudist. He was no longer a gaunt, pale man. He was a man with long, unkempt hair and a tangled beard, a man who looked exactly like the original description of the nudist. But Arthur, the man in the jail cell, was bald and clean-shaven. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. They were not dealing with one person. They were dealing with two. A pair of conspirators, a sick, twisted duo. He went back to the jail, to a visibly shaken Arthur. He sat in the cell, his voice low and calm. "Arthur, who else is with you? Who is leaving you the gifts? Who is a part of the faceless ones?" Arthur, his face a mask of pure terror, shook his head. No, I don't know. He's a ghost. He comes and goes. He doesn't speak. He just watches." "Does he look like you?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "Does he have a birth defect? Does he have a mark on his hand?" A flicker of recognition and then a wave of fear crossed Arthur's face. He has a hand like a claw, yes. Just like the one in the drawings. He's the one. He's the one who gave me the gifts. Elias felt a new wave of nausea wash over him. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality. A horrifying, violent reality. The claw marks, the blood, the human tooth. It all fit. The man with the claw hand was the real perpetrator. He was the one who was killing people and using Arthur, his mentally unstable brother, as a scapegoat. He went to Sheriff Thompson, a man who was now a broken, defeated shell of his former self. He laid it all out, the theory of the two brothers, the one with the birth defect, the one who was mentally unstable. The one who was a ghost, a phantom who was terrorizing the town. Thompson, now on the verge of a nervous breakdown, agreed to go to the only person who could give them a lead. The owner of the local orphanage. The orphanage had been in town for years, and the owner, a kind old woman named Mrs. Gable, had a detailed log of every child who had passed through her doors. Elias and Thompson went to the orphanage, their hearts a cold, tight knot in their chests. They sat with Mrs. Gable, their hands shaking as they turned the fragile, yellowed pages of the logbook. They looked for the names Arthur and Thomas. They looked for any mention of a birth defect, a twin, anything that could give them a lead. They found it. A small, almost invisible entry on the page. Arthur, age 7. Thomas, age 7. Twin brothers. Orphaned. Thomas has a congenital hand deformity. Fingers are fused together. Elias, a new wave of dread washed over him. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality. A horrifying, violent reality. He was the one who was killing people and using Arthur, his mentally unstable brother, as a scapegoat. They had found their man. The man with the claw hand. The man who was killing people. The man who was orchestrating the terror. He was not a phantom. He was a man with a name, a history, a motive. Elias went back to the jail, to a visibly shaken Arthur. He sat in the cell, his voice low and calm. "Arthur, where is your brother?" Arthur, his face a mask of pure terror, shook his head. No, I don't know. He's a ghost. He comes and goes. He doesn't speak. He just watches." "Does he look like you?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "Does he have a birth defect? Does he have a mark on his hand?" A flicker of recognition, and then a wave of fear crossed Arthur's face. He has a hand like a claw. Yes. Just like the one in the drawings. He's the one who gave me the gifts. Elias felt a new wave of nausea wash over him. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality. A horrifying, violent reality. The claw marks, the blood, the human tooth. It all fit. The man with the claw hand was the real perpetrator. He was the one who was killing people and using Arthur, his mentally unstable brother, as a scapegoat. He went to Sheriff Thompson, a man who was now a broken, defeated shell of his former self. He laid it all out. The theory of the two brothers, the one with the birth defect, the one who was mentally unstable, the one who was a ghost, a phantom who was terrorizing the town. Thompson, now on the verge of a nervous breakdown, agreed to go to the only person who could give them a lead, the owner of the local orphanage. The orphanage had been in town for years, and the owner, a kind old woman named Mrs. Gable, had a detailed log of every child who had passed through her doors. Elias and Thompson went to the orphanage, their hearts a cold, tight knot in their chests. They sat with Mrs. Gable, their hands shaking as they turned the fragile, yellowed pages of the logbook. They looked for the names Arthur and Thomas. They looked for any mention of a birth defect, a twin, anything that could give them a lead. They found it. A small, almost invisible entry on the page. Arthur, age 7. Thomas, age 7. Twin brothers. Orphaned. Thomas has a congenital hand deformity. Fingers are fused together. Elias, a new wave of dread washed over him. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality. A horrifying, violent reality. He was the one who was killing people and using Arthur, his mentally unstable brother, as a scapegoat. They had found their man, the man with the claw hand, the man who was killing people, the man who was orchestrating the terror. He was not a phantom. He was a man with a name, a history, a motive. Elias went back to the jail, to a visibly shaken Arthur. He sat in the cell, his voice low and calm. "Arthur, where is your brother?" Arthur, his face a mask of pure terror, shook his head. No, I don't know. He's a ghost. He comes and goes. He doesn't speak. He just watches." "Does he look like you?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "Does he have a birth defect? Does he have a mark on his hand?" A flicker of recognition, and then a wave of fear crossed Arthur's face. He has a hand like a claw. Yes, just like the one in the drawings. He's the one. He's the one who gave me the gifts." Elias felt a new wave of nausea wash over him. The faceless ones were not a delusion. They were a reality. A horrifying, violent reality. The claw marks, the blood, the human tooth. It all fit. The man with the claw hand was the real perpetrator. He was the one who was killing people and using Arthur, his mentally unstable brother, as a scapegoat. He went to Sheriff Thompson, a man who was now a broken, defeated shell of his former self. He laid it all out. The theory of the two brothers, the one with the birth defect, the one who was mentally unstable, the one who was a ghost, a phantom who was terrorizing the town. Thompson, now on the verge of a nervous breakdown, agreed to go to the only person who could give them a lead, the owner of the local orphanage. The orphanage had been in town for years, and the owner, a kind old woman named Mrs. Gable, had a detailed log of every child who had passed through her doors. Elias and Thompson went to the orphanage, their hearts a cold, tight knot in their chests. They sat with Mrs. Gable, their hands shaking as they turned the fragile, yellowed pages of the logbook. They looked for the names Arthur and Thomas. They looked for any mention of a birth defect, a twin, anything that could give them a lead. They found it. A small, almost invisible entry on the page. Arthur, age 7. Thomas, age 7. Twin brothers, orphaned. Thomas has a congenital hand deformity. Fingers are fused together. Elias felt a wave of icy coldness wash over him. It was all a lie. The Nudist, the terror, the solar eclipse. It was all a performance, a sick, twisted game designed to terrorize the town. The full moon cast long, eerie shadows across the dusty streets of El Paso. The town, now a city on high alert, was a silent, tense entity. Elias and Sheriff Thompson, armed and grim-faced, were on the hunt. They had a name, a motive, and a killer on the loose. Thomas. the man with the claw hand, the true nudist of El Paso. They followed the only logical lead they had, the orphanage. They knew Thomas had been raised there and that he had a deep-seated hatred for the town that had rejected him for his birth defect. They knew he was a man who had been consumed by a burning rage, a man who had now come back to exact his revenge. They searched the orphanage, the desolate grounds, the old, crumbling buildings. They found nothing. No clues, no signs of a camp, no sign of a man who was now a killer. Elias, however, had a new, more terrifying thought. Thomas was a man of logic, a man who planned his attacks with a chilling precision. He would not have returned to a place that held such painful memories. He would have gone to the place that represented his ultimate revenge. He would have gone to the place where he could strike at the heart of the town's respectability. He would have gone to the sheriff's office. Elias and Thompson raced back to the office, their hearts pounding in their chests. They found it unlocked, a single lantern burning on the desk, and on the desk, a small, intricate carving of a horse. It was a carving so detailed, so lifelike, that it could only have been made by a man who was consumed by his work, a man who was meticulous, a man who was a killer, and next to the carving, a single handwritten note. It was not a message of hate. It was a message of pity. It was addressed to Elias. It read, "You were the only one who saw. You were the only one who believed. But you were too late. The sun is setting on your world. And the night is mine." Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. The note was not a threat. It was a goodbye. Thomas wasn't here. He was gone. He had done what he had set out to do. He had terrified the town, he had used his brother, and he had now left, a ghost who was free from the world's lies. The terror, however, was not over. The next morning, a group of freighters heading east found a small, makeshift grave near the Rio Grande. It was unmarked, a simple mound of dirt with a single wooden cross on top. And on the cross, a small, intricately carved wooden figurine of a girl with a peaceful, smiling face. It was Sarah. Elias felt a wave of crushing defeat wash over him. He had been too late. He had solved the mystery. He had found the killer. But he had lost the one thing that mattered. He had lost the one thing that could have brought the town back from the brink. The town, which had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief, was now plunged into a new, more intense terror. The nudist was a ghost, a phantom who had come and gone, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. The terror of El Paso was over. But the wounds, the fear, the paranoia would last a lifetime. The town would never be the same, and Elias, a man who had believed in logic and reason, was now faced with a reality that defied all logic, a reality that was a horrifying amalgamation of grief, delusion, and madness. He was no longer a man who dealt with facts. He was a man who had stared into the abyss and who was now forced to live with the knowledge that the world was a far more terrifying place than he had ever imagined. The nudist of El Paso was not a monster. He was a human, a broken man who had been pushed to the edge and who had taken the entire town with him. The terror was over, but the nightmare had just begun.